For over 60 years a simple fruit tart sat in the village bakery. Its golden lattice crust admired. Its sweet aroma craved, but no one knew it. Held a secret powerful enough to rewrite a family's legacy, ignite old rivalries, and drive someone to murder. When Miss Marple is invited for what seems like a harmless afternoon tea, she finds herself slicing into more than just dessert. She's cutting straight into a mystery layered with deception, betrayal, and a recipe coded with deadly truth. Late September draped the village of Elderwood Hollow in a hush of golden melancholy, the air crisp with the scent of turning leaves and distant chimney smoke, as if nature herself held her breath. The annual autumn fair, once a humble celebration of fruit preserves and root vegetables, had erupted this year into something far grander, almost theatrical in its anticipation. The village hall, adorned with cascading ivy, bunting stitched by hand, and lanterns that cast flickering amber shadows across polished floors, brimmed with life and curiosity. But underneath the chatter and laughter, there pulsed an odd undercurrent, one that Miss Agatha Renford, with her discerning eyes and impeccable memory for human behavior, could feel in her bones. The focus of the crowd was not merely on the displays, Mrs. Thistle's black currant jam, Colonel Farnsworth's pyramid of waxed apples, or young Millie Hargrave's lavender-spiced honey. No, all eyes drifted, eventually, inevitably, toward the velvet-draped glass case at the front of the hall, where the mysterious and long-guarded recipe of Mr. Percival Holloway, Elderwood's reclusive master baker, was to be revealed. Holloway, a man of few words and thick flour-dusted hands, had earned whispered fame beyond the village for his orchard tart, so perfectly balanced it was said to make even the bitterest heart soften. That such a man would surrender his secret to Gastronome Quarterly, an elite London culinary magazine, was cause enough for attention, but what truly stirred the pot was the unannounced return of Edward Ashcombe. Lean, composed with storm-grey eyes that had seen war, ruin and exile, Edward had not set foot in Elderwood for 16 years, ever since his unexplained departure after a catastrophic falling out with his aunt, Lady Constance Ashcombe, matriarch of the sprawling and decaying Thornfield estate. Theirs had been the sort of feud that became legend, one so poisonous that even servants dared not speak of it aloud. And yet here he was, dressed impeccably in a wool overcoat, and speaking with the vicar as though no time had passed, though his sharp gaze often darted toward his aunt, who stood among the crowd like a marble statue, her gloved hands unmoving, her expression carved from frost. "She detests gatherings like this," whispered Mrs. Bexley to Agatha, as if fearing even the walls might repeat her words. "Only ever appears when duty demands it." Agatha nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere, watching how Lady Constance's left thumb tapped ever so slightly against her purse clasp, a habit Agatha recalled from years past, always a sign she was concealing something. As the hour approached 3, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations quieted. The photographer from Gastronome Quarterly, a sallow-faced man with tired eyes and a constant sniff, barked instructions and rearranged people like props in a staged play. Holloway, dressed in a jacket so stiff it looked like it had never seen flour, approached the case with a solemnity that bordered on ritual. From his inside pocket, he drew an envelope sealed in rich crimson wax, the recipe itself, the crown jewel of the village's culinary lore. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from something else, something Agatha could not yet name. Just as he placed the envelope into the display case, and the photographer's bulb flashed with a hiss, a strange gust of wind surged through the closed hall, rattling the bunting, and extinguishing several lanterns along the walls. The doors remained shut, no one had moved. Yet in that brief flicker of darkness and confusion, the envelope vanished, simply ceased to be. No shattering glass, no open latch, just nothing. A collective gasp echoed across the room like a gasp from the earth itself. Eyes widened, necks craned, and for a long shivering moment, not a single voice rose to break the spell. Mr. Holloway stared at the empty case in disbelief, his face losing all its color. Lady Constance's eyes narrowed to slits. Edward took one slow step forward, the muscles in his jaw clenched. And Miss Agatha Renford, who had seen many things in her lifetime, but never a disappearance so clean, so theatrical, felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck. Someone had planned this. Someone inside that room, standing quietly among jam jars and apple pyramids, had stolen not just a recipe, but a secret much older and darker, and in doing so, they had awakened something in the heart of Elderwood Hollow that had long been buried beneath civility and tradition. This was no longer a village festival. This was the beginning of a reckoning. 3 weeks had passed since the harvest gala, but Elderwood Hollow had not yet exhaled. The memory of the vanished recipe hung over the village like a fog that refused to lift. Conversations in tea shops and whispers in the grocers' aisles inevitably circled back to the same question: how could a sealed glass case be breached in a room full of witnesses, many of them of excellent character, and leave no trace behind? Miss Agatha Renford, whose observational talents rivaled those of any metropolitan detective, sat now in her ivy-clad cottage, the sound of rain rhythmically tapping the window panes as she arranged warm scones on a porcelain dish older than most of the village itself. The fire cracked gently in the hearth, casting flickers of gold upon the faces of her weekly tea guests. Alderidge, stooped and red-eyed from a recent loss, Miss Fenley, who taught French but never travelled beyond Devon, and Reverend Bell, who had recently delivered a sermon titled "The Devil in the Details." "Such a shame about that recipe," muttered Mrs. Alderidge, staring into her tea as though answers might steep there. "Poor Mr. Thorne hasn't been himself since. I saw him near the bakery just last night, talking to himself, pacing like a man possessed." Agatha nodded slightly, but said nothing, her eyes drifting to the shadows, dancing just beneath the antique sideboard. "And Lady Harrowby," Miss Fenley continued in a hushed voice, "I passed her estate yesterday. Every curtain drawn, no lights. I swear I saw Miss Graves, her solicitor, slipping out the back gate wearing a brown coat stained with flour." Agatha's fingers, curled around her teacup, tightened almost imperceptibly. "Curious," she said softly, her tone laced with implication. "Mr. Graves was at the harvest gala, was he not?" Reverend Bell, who had remained silent thus far, finally spoke. "They say the recipe contained something more, a name perhaps, a confession, a map. Old Mr. Holloway wasn't just a baker, you know his grandfather served as a confidential clerk to the Duke of Moreland." That drew a silence heavy and immediate. The implications were chilling. Agatha's thoughts drifted back to the gala. The flicker of the lights, the momentary darkness, the precise way the envelope had vanished like a magician's sleight of hand. No broken glass, no disturbed lock, as if it had simply ceased to exist. And yet something else had shifted in that room. Not just the recipe, but the very balance of trust. Edward Thornfield, the estranged heir who had returned under the guise of nostalgia, had since been seen multiple times lingering near the Mill Road, speaking with foreign men who carried cameras but never took photos. And Lady Harrowby, who claimed to despise gatherings, had hosted 3 private suppers since the theft, with guests who entered through the conservatory and never appeared in the front parlor. Secrets never stay buried in a place like this, Agatha said at last, her voice calm but resolute. They ferment like cider left too long in the barrel, sweet at first, but with a sting that will make the tongue curl. The fire popped in agreement. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Somewhere in the village a dog began to howl. And in that moment, Agatha knew the recipe was merely a key, a decoy even. The true mystery lay in what it unlocked, and who was willing to kill to keep it hidden. Outside, a restless wind coiled through the narrow cobbled lanes of Elmsworth, dragging with it the scent of rain-soaked earth and chimney smoke, while inside Rose Hollow Cottage, a curious hush had fallen over the ladies' afternoon gathering. A silence broken only by the rhythmic clink of spoons against porcelain teacups and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. "You saw Mr. Hemsworth's solicitor." Clara Midgley's voice sliced through the quiet, her eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed spectacles. "At the back door of Hatfield Confectionery past midnight." Miss Lavinia Greaves gave a deliberate nod, her gaze steady. "He was cloaked, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle, and looking over his shoulder like a man being followed. I watched from my window for a full 5 minutes. Then he knocked 3 times, slowly, and was let in by someone unseen. The room, heavy with the scent of lavender and lemon biscuits, stilled. Why on earth would a solicitor need to sneak into an old bakery in the middle of the night? muttered Mrs. Dorothea Chalmers, brushing crumbs from her lap, her fingers trembling slightly. Unless it wasn't about baking at all. Or perhaps, Lavinia added with quiet menace, it was baking of a different sort. Miss Eleanor Hartley, who had thus far remained silent, leaned forward, her voice low and laced with unease. It reminds me of the Fenwood affair, do you remember? Mrs. Partridge was caught smuggling altered wills inside pie crusts, hidden beneath layers of almond cream. That was nearly hushed up, but I had a cousin on the town council. Eliza Brandt, the quietest among them, set her cup down, and spoke with eerie calm. 2 nights ago, I was walking past the shoemaker's when I heard voices from above. Mr. Hemsworth and the new lodger, the one who wears the brown scarf and never says a word in the post office. They were arguing about a ledger. I distinctly heard Hemsworth say, "You'll find nothing in the bakery now." The recipe was more than a list, it was a code. And then he said something odd, "That tart saved my life once and it might have to do so again." A breath caught in Clara's throat. A code, what sort of code? A protective one perhaps, Eliza murmured, or a warning. And the stranger left the very next morning. Disappeared without settling his rent. The shoemaker's daughter said he burned papers in the hearth before he vanished. The room grew colder, as though the fire had drawn back from the hearth. And Lady Audley, Clara whispered, has received another anonymous letter. No signature, no return address. It mentioned Harrogate Hall and the poisoned apple tart again. That was the same dessert her sister ate the night she died, wasn't it? Silence fell like a guillotine. They called it food poisoning, said Dorothea, but the doctor destroyed the remains before anyone could test them. And just last week her maid collapsed after sampling Hemsworth's new spiced apple turnovers. Another coincidence. Or a pattern, Lavinia said flatly. He's not just a baker, not anymore. And if those recipes are what I think they are, they're not meant for nourishment, they're meant for silence. Miss Hartley pressed a hand to her chest. I knew something felt wrong. Ever since the fire in the old bakery 10 years ago. They said it was an accident, but only the back room burned, the one where he kept his family's journals. And remember how quickly the insurance was paid out. He's hiding something, Eliza agreed, her voice a whisper, something dangerous. And whatever it is, it's resurfacing now. Rain began to hammer at the windows, sharp and sudden, like urgent fingers tapping to be let in. Miss Greaves stared into the fireplace, her eyes reflecting the flames. Secrets baked into tart shells, ledgers buried beneath flour sacks, and now, a solicitor at midnight. No, my dears, this is not about sugar and spice, this is about revenge, about something left unfinished. Outside, lightning split the sky in two, and somewhere in the distance, a dog began to howl. The ladies sat frozen, their afternoon tea forgotten. As though each of them suddenly realized that the village they thought they knew had been masking something far darker beneath its quaint, butter-scented surface, and that perhaps the next crumb they followed might just lead them to a truth none of them were prepared to swallow. Miss Eugenia Vale stood at her cottage doorway, the soft golden lamp behind her casting a long trembling shadow across the rain-slick stones at her feet, as she watched Mrs. Holloway's hunched figure struggle against the gusting wind, her tartan umbrella tilting like a frail ship in a storm, her boots squelching in the saturated soil of the garden path. There was something about the whole affair that clung to Eugenia, like the mist curling around her windowsills, elusive, damp and persistent. It wasn't just the mystery of the vanished recipe, but the way it had disappeared, the timing, the hushed tones, the tremor in Old Thorne's voice. The last time she saw him, like a man clutching something far more dangerous than cinnamon and sugar. She closed the door quietly behind her, and turned back toward the sitting room, where the fire had died down to a dull glow. Her fingers brushing the back of the armchair as she passed, her mind threading through memories like delicate yarn. The analogy struck her again. This was just like one of her intricate knitting patterns, where one stitch dropped somewhere far back in the rows, subtly derailed the entire design, nearly invisible, but capable of destroying everything unless painstakingly traced and corrected. And then the memory flared again. The Darrington case, the missing letter, written in trembling ink on foreign stationery, found years later behind the false bottom of a sewing box, revealing not only the truth of the will, but exposing a motive so cold, it still sent shivers down her spine. Was it possible that Mr. Thorne's final recipe hid something equally dangerous? Coded instructions, a confession, a map to an inheritance, perhaps even a name written in disguise. And now he was dead, not peacefully, not gently, but in his bakery, slumped among trays of flour and broken crockery, his body cold before dawn broke. When the early morning rustle of footsteps and shouts pierced her sleep, she'd already half expected it. When she parted the lace curtain and saw Alec the stable boy running, his boots slick with mud, his face ashen, and Constable Redding puffing behind him like a man outrun by the truth, she knew. And yet when the telephone rang, slicing through the silence like a knife through sponge cake, and Lady Ashcroft's broken voice confirmed it.
He's dead, Eugenia.
They say it was almond essence, poisoned, or an accident. But Flora found him and she's a wreck. The poor girl, even then her heart only slowed a little, her mind already miles ahead, putting together clues no one else had even begun to suspect. Almond extract after all could kill. But it could also be used to cover something else. The scent of almonds masking the bite of cyanide. How dreadful, Eugenia had replied, her voice laced with calm concern, though her pulse had already taken on the rhythm of deduction. She dressed deliberately, charcoal wool coat, hat with the single black feather, a silver brooch shaped like a key, and stepped out into a village vibrating with suppressed hysteria. The air smelled of wet earth and secrets. People clustered at corners, shielding their mouths as much from the cold as from the weight of their words. A sign hastily pinned to the bakery's window read "Closed due to unforeseen circumstances," but no sign could explain the way the front door hung slightly ajar, as if reluctant to close upon what lay inside. Inspector Letham emerged just then, rain glistening on his coat, and irritation dancing in his eyes when he saw her. "Miss Vale," he said with a short nod. "I trust you're keeping dry." "As much as one can in such damp circumstances," she replied, voice even, eyes sharp. "And what of Mr. Thorne? So careful, so precise. How does a man like that make a fatal mistake with almonds?" "We believe it was accidental," Letham said. "Too quickly. Too much extract. A slip of the hand." But Eugenia only offered a vague smile, and let him go, knowing the truth was never that simple. And then from the corner of her eye she saw her. The girl standing like a ghost beneath the side awning, eyes rimmed red, apron stained with flour, and something darker. Flora Maynard, barely 22, shaking as though the ground beneath her held some secret trying to speak through her bones. "Miss Maynard," Eugenia called softly, stepping through the wet gravel. "Are you all right?" Flora flinched but didn't run. Her voice when it came, was barely a whisper. "I found him, this morning. He'd stayed late, said he was working on something special, he told me. He said, if anything happened to look in the tin, the ginger scone tin, he said no one would think to check there." "What was he working on?" Eugenia pressed gently. Flora looked up at her, eyes hollow. "It wasn't a recipe. I don't know what it was, numbers, strange phrases, Latin maybe. He was burning the edges of it when I left last night. Said it had to be hidden. That someone was watching." At that Eugenia felt a strange chill crawl up her spine. The rain tapped steadily against the tin gutters, the village's breath held behind cottage walls, and somewhere beyond the steeple, a crow cried once before going silent. "Then we must find that tin," she said, her voice suddenly sharp with purpose. "Because I fear Mr. Thorne didn't just die over almond oil, he died over what he was trying to protect, and whoever took that recipe may not stop at one death." Softly approaching the girl who stood pale and trembling beneath the rain-darkened eaves of the bakery, the faint scent of yeast and sugar lingering around her, Miss Eleanora Vale reached out with a gentle touch to steady Anya's quivering hand and whispered with genuine warmth, "I am so very sorry about Mr. Hollinger, dear. What a terrible shock it must have been for you." Anya blinked back tears, dabbing furiously at her eyes with a crumpled flour-stained handkerchief, her voice trembling as she replied, "It was awful, Miss Vale. I arrived just before dawn, like I always do, and found him, lying there, just beyond the mixing table, clutching an empty vial of almond essence. His face it was turning so pale, his lips blue. I couldn't believe it. I thought he was asleep at first, but then, her voice broke, and she swallowed hard, struggling to continue. Poor Mr. Hollinger, he was always so careful. Miss Vale's eyes softened with sympathy. And the constable, have they questioned you extensively? Anya shook her head, wiping her nose on her sleeve. Not much, no. Dr. Whitlow said it was an allergic reaction, severe and sudden, and Inspector Merrin seemed satisfied with that. But it doesn't add up. Mr. Hollinger always hated almonds, said the smell gave him headaches. He never used almonds or almond extract in his baking. Not once. Eleanora's gaze sharpened, her mind immediately racing. And yet there was that bottle in his hand. Empty, you say? Anya nodded, her brows knit in confusion. Yes, but it wasn't like any almond extract I've ever seen. No label, no mark, just plain amber glass, and no supplier stamp. Mr. Hollinger was meticulous. Every ingredient had a proper place, every bottle labeled clearly. This one was out of place, and I've never seen it before. Eleanora's thoughts tangled with questions. Who had brought this strange bottle? And why? Did Mr. Hollinger have any visitors recently? Anyone unusual coming, or going late? Only Mr. Linton, his solicitor. Anya answered hesitantly. He's been coming after hours, several times a week. They talked in whispers in the back room. Mr. Hollinger seemed worried afterward, sometimes glancing around like he feared being overheard. One day he said, "If anything happens to me, the ledger drawer beneath the false panel holds the key." I never dared to look. Eleanora's pulse quickened. The phrase false panel was a promise of secrets buried deep. And does Mr. Hollinger have any family? She asked. Anya shook her head. None that I know of, just himself and the bakery. He spoke little of his past, except once about a military service he left behind. A chapter he never wanted reopened. The shadows deepened in Eleanora's mind as she pieced these fragments together. Later, as she passed the village pharmacy, she found Dr. Whitlow stepping out into the chill morning air, his face etched with concern beneath the creased brow and graying hair. "Miss Vale," he said in his gruff, straightforward manner, "a tragic case, truly." The allergic reaction was swift and deadly, but not typical. The symptoms were unusual, far too rapid and severe for a normal allergy. And that bottle, found empty in his hand. Well, that's what puzzles me most. It's odd the almond essence was even there at all. Eleanora's eyes narrowed. Do you think it could have been tampered with? The doctor shrugged, reluctant but honest. It's possible. The bottle was different from the usual brands. No labels, no traceable origin. And Mr. Hollinger never used almonds, you say? He loathed them, Eleanora confirmed quietly. Yet someone gave him this bottle, or he found it, knowing it could be fatal. The door was locked from the inside, she asked, recalling the police report. Yes, Dr. Whitlow said. No signs of struggle. It all points to accidental death, but I'm not convinced. The whole thing feels too neat, too carefully staged. Eleanora's thoughts spiraled as she turned away, her eyes catching movement by the churchyard. There, beneath the ancient gravestones, stood a solitary figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably Edward Witherspoon, the village historian, who had always taken a peculiar interest in local mysteries. He was studying a weathered headstone, with an intensity that suggested secrets long buried beneath the soil. Eleanora adjusted her course, curiosity piqued and determination stealing her heart. The church records, she recalled, reached back centuries, filled with cryptic entries and hidden connections. Tomorrow, she decided, she would visit the vicar under the pretense of discussing flower arrangements for the upcoming harvest festival. But her true aim would be to uncover the truth behind the ledger, the false panel, and the shadowed history Mr. Hollinger had guarded so fiercely. Because something told her, this death was no accident, but a carefully crafted puzzle waiting for the right mind to solve it. The morning after Mr. Aldridge's funeral dawned clear and crisp, the kind of gentle autumn sunshine that seemed to linger a little longer, as if reluctant to let go of summer's last brilliance before the frost would claim the fading blooms. Miss Marple, as was her habit, rose early and found solace in tending her roses, the delicate task grounding her swirling thoughts. It was then that the garden gate creaked open softly, and she looked up to see Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, a practical woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and an air of quiet strength, walking up the path with a purposeful step. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she greeted cheerfully, though there was an undercurrent of urgency beneath her calm tone. Miss Marple, straightening with the familiar stiffness that came with age but never dulled her keen mind, invited her to sit on the garden bench. Their conversation drifted first to the service, which had been well attended, and then to the curious presence of Lady Penelope, an unexpected visitor at such a rural funeral, who, according to the vicar, had insisted on attending out of some mysterious family responsibility, a phrase that pricked Miss Marple's curiosity sharply. Mrs. Clement then dropped a subtle but crucial detail. Mr. Aldridge had been frequently seen in the parish records room in the weeks before his death, poring over old marriage registers from the 1890s. This revelation sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. The Aldridge family was known to have settled in St. Mary Me only after the Great War, so why delve into records from decades before? Her fingers instinctively twitched as if knitting invisible threads of thought, weaving connections between past and present. What secret was he seeking, and why had it cost him his life? Lost in these dark reflections, Miss Marple barely noticed the tall figure standing quietly at her garden gate, until a shadow fell across the blooming roses. It was Edward Witherspoon, returned unexpectedly to St. Mary Me after 15 long years abroad. His aristocratic features, high forehead, sharp nose, and an air of quiet authority, immediately recognizable. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, doffing his hat with old-world politeness, though there was an edge of tension in his voice. Inviting him inside, she poured tea as her sharp eyes studied him more closely than before. There was something restrained in his demeanor, a story unspoken, a burden carried in silence. Could his return be linked to Mr. Aldridge's sudden death? Was it mere coincidence, or a deliberate part of a carefully orchestrated plan to bury an inconvenient truth deep beneath layers of forgotten history? As the autumn light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the small sitting room, Miss Marple's mind raced to unravel the threads of this intricate puzzle, a puzzle woven from long-buried secrets, veiled family loyalties, and the faint whispers of a past that refused to remain silent. The village, so peaceful on the surface, held its breath, hiding more than it revealed, and Miss Marple knew that beneath the calm facade lurked a storm of revelations waiting to break free, one that might change everything she thought she knew about the people around her, and the silent forces that had shaped their lives in ways no one had dared to suspect. An unmistakable tension clung to Edward Witherspoon as he sat rigidly opposite Miss Marple, his fingers tapping an irregular rhythm against the arm of the chair, a restless cadence betraying the turmoil beneath his composed exterior. "It must feel like quite a change," Miss Marple remarked gently, her hand steady as she poured the tea, the faint clink of the china punctuating the quiet room. "Coming back to St. Mary Me after all these years abroad." Edward's lips curved into a faint bittersweet smile, but his eyes carried a shadow of something deeper, a reluctant admission as he replied, "Yes, though in many ways it feels as though nothing has shifted. The same faces linger like ghosts, the same weather-beaten cottages still stand, and the old prejudices, as stubborn as ever, hang heavy in the air. Village memories are long indeed, too long sometimes." Miss Marple nodded, her voice soft yet tinged with a sadness born from years of watching similar stories unfold. "It is always a sorrow when families drift apart, especially over grievances that seem in hindsight so avoidable." Edward's gaze sharpened, almost piercing, as if probing her to measure the limits of her knowledge. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "separation is the only refuge one can find when misrepresentation and betrayal cut too deep." Miss Marple, eyes softened with sympathy. "How distressing for you," she murmured, before carefully steering the conversation. "And now, your return coincides so sadly with poor Mr. Aldridge's untimely death." Edward's expression grew guarded, the faintest flicker of unease crossing his face. "Yes, unfortunate timing, though I barely knew the man." "Really?" Miss Marple's surprise was genuine. "I heard you were seen in a rather animated conversation with him recently," right there in the village square. A brief flash of annoyance crossed Edward's features, quickly masked by practiced calm. News travels fast in St. Mary Me, he acknowledged. Yes, we spoke briefly, and only on professional matters, nothing of consequence. Professional matters, Miss Marple repeated, a note of innocent curiosity coloring her voice. I wasn't aware you and Mr. Aldridge shared any profession. We did not, Edward replied sharply. I merely sought to inquire if he had uncovered anything unusual in his research. I understand he had taken a keen interest in local family histories. Ah yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, he was delving into parish records shortly before his death, wasn't he? Those old registers hold so many secrets, births, marriages, deaths, a tapestry of lives woven through centuries of village history. Edward set down his teacup with a slight clatter that seemed out of place amidst his otherwise controlled demeanor. Well, Miss Marple, thank you for the tea, but I must be going. I have an appointment with Mr. Graves this afternoon. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed imperceptibly at the mention of Lady Penelope's solicitor. How convenient that he manages so many of the village's delicate affairs, she mused. After Edward's tall figure disappeared down the lane, Miss Marple lingered by the window, her mind churning, not so much on what had been said, but on the silences and evasions woven through their conversation. Later, the shrill ring of the telephone shattered the quiet, and it was Dolly Bantry on the line, her voice trembling with excitement and barely suppressed intrigue. Jane, you won't believe this. Lady Penelope has called in a new solicitor all the way from London, not Mr. Graves, mind you, and she's suddenly revising her will. Colonel Bantry heard it at the golf club, from old Simpson, who heard it from his daughter, who works as a maid at Thornfield Estate. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin contemplative line. Most unusual, she said quietly, especially considering Lady Penelope's decades-long reliance on Mr. Graves for all her legal matters. Dolly's voice lowered conspiratorial. And there's more, she's invited Edward to dine at Thornfield tonight, the first time he's set foot in that house since their terrible falling out 15 years ago. After replacing the receiver, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the steady rhythm of the needles a comforting metronome to her racing thoughts. Each stitch seemed to weave together the tangled threads of her investigation, the missing recipe that had surfaced like a clue, Mr. Aldridge's obsessive research into parish records, his sudden and suspicious death, Edward Witherspoon's unexpected and enigmatic return, and now Lady Penelope's dramatic legal upheaval. Something profound was stirring beneath the polished facade of Thornfield Estate, a secret rooted deep in a past no one dared revisit, and the humble baker had stumbled upon knowledge that posed a deadly threat to someone powerful. Miss Marple's conviction grew with every passing moment that the recipe was nothing more than a smokescreen for a far more dangerous truth, something worth killing for. Outside, the afternoon waned, shadows stretching long and dark across her garden as the imposing chimneys of Thornfield Estate pierced the dusky sky like silent sentinels, standing as grim monuments to generations of wealth, privilege and secrets that now threatened to unravel and drag the village's carefully guarded peace into a dangerous storm. Miss Marple had always placed great faith in the power of routine, believing that seemingly small habits often unearthed hidden truths that might otherwise remain overlooked. So in the days following Miss Aldridge's funeral, she made it a point to visit the bakery each morning, ostensibly to buy a small loaf or a few scones, but in truth to observe young Flora Bennet, who had unexpectedly taken over the running of the shop with an air of quiet efficiency that both intrigued and concerned her. "Good morning, Miss Bennet," she greeted, stepping into the shop on a particularly sharp and chilly morning, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully, a stark contrast to the somber black armband Flora wore over her immaculate white uniform. "I trust you're managing such a responsibility well, especially at your age." Flora looked up from carefully arranging a tray of buns, her smile weary but sincere. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Yes, I'm coping. Mr. Aldridge trained me well, and I've been following his methods to the letter." Miss Marple nodded approvingly, her gaze drifting around the quiet shop, still empty at this early hour, affording her the chance she'd been waiting for. "I imagine he must have left detailed instructions. He struck me as a man of method," Flora brushed a stray lock of brown hair from her forehead and nodded emphatically. You have no idea. Everything had to be just so. His recipes, his accounts, even the exact way the storeroom was arranged. He kept meticulous records. Records? Miss Marple inquired casually, knowing that many business owners were rather lax in such matters. Flora chuckled softly. Journals. Dozens of them, some dating back over 30 years. He wrote in them daily. Notes not only on recipes and finances but on the village itself, its people, their comings and goings. Miss Marple's interest sharpened perceptibly. How fascinating, almost like a village historian. I suppose so, Flora agreed, fetching Miss Marple's usual order of scones. Though some entries are almost personal, like gossip, names, dates, little observations. I only glance at them, of course. They're very private. Of course, my dear. One wouldn't dream of prying. Miss Marple soothed gently. Are they kept here in the bakery? Flora nodded, wrapping the scones carefully. Yes, in a locked cabinet in the back room. Mr. Graves came by just yesterday to look at them. Said it was necessary to settle Mr. Aldridge's affairs. But he seemed most interested in one particular journal from around 1895, and asked if he could take it away. But I refused. Mr. Aldridge was always very clear. Those papers were never to leave the bakery. How conscientious of you, Miss Marple said with approval. Mr. Aldridge would have been pleased by your loyalty. Then, as if a sudden thought struck her, she asked, have you had any other visitors inquiring about Mr. Aldridge's papers? A flicker of surprise crossed Flora's face. Reward with a spoon, perhaps. How did you know? He came just yesterday afternoon, asking similar questions, wanting to know if Mr. Aldridge left anything mentioning the Witherspoon family. I told him I hadn't thoroughly looked through the journals yet and couldn't say. Very wise, I'd say. Miss Marple murmured, one must be cautious in matters like these. She paid for her scones, and was about to leave when the bell above the door jingled again. A tall, scholarly-looking man with spectacles entered, removing his hat to reveal thinning grey hair. Good morning, he said in a voice that marked him as an outsider. I'm looking for Miss Bennet. I'm Professor Hargreaves from King's College London. Flora stepped forward. I'm Flora Bennet. Ah, excellent. The professor smiled pleasantly. I understand the late Mr. Aldridge had a keen interest in local history. I'm researching family lineages in this area, especially the old families like the Witherspoons, and was told he might have valuable information. Miss Marple paused by the door, watched their exchange with keen interest, sensing a deeper current beneath the surface. Flora seemed hesitant, the faintest shadow crossing her face, perhaps the silent recognition that this bakery was far more than just a place to buy bread, but a repository of secrets capable of altering lives. Holding her warm cup of tea later, Miss Marple pondered the web beginning to unravel before her eyes. The diaries, the visitors, the whispered histories, and felt a chill of anticipation mixed with dread. This hidden past, these locked-away journals, these determined strangers, all pointed toward a revelation that might shake the village to its core, resurrecting old grudges and dark truths long buried beneath polite smiles and quiet streets. Mr. Aldridge did keep some historical records, Flora Bennet admitted with a hesitant glance toward Miss Marple, though she seemed reluctant to delve too deeply into their nature, explaining quietly. But as I was just telling Miss Marple, they're rather personal. I'm not sure I ought to say much more. The unease in her voice was unmistakable, hinting that these records were more than mere business logs or dusty family trees. They were repositories of something secret, perhaps even dangerous. Professor Hargreaves, a tall man with sharp eyes hidden behind scholarly spectacles, smiled with practiced ease and said smoothly, I understand your caution, Miss Bennet. Perhaps over a cup of tea, you might be willing to answer a few questions. My research focuses on the year 1895, an especially intriguing period for the local gentry, wouldn't you agree? Miss Marple's interest peaked sharply at the mention of that year, the very same year Mr. Graves had shown an almost obsessive fascination with, a coincidence that felt too deliberate to ignore. Noticing Flora's discomfort under the professor's intense scrutiny, Miss Marple stepped forward with gentle authority, and introduced herself calmly. I'm Jane Marple, and I've lived here in St. Mary Me all my life. My father served as the vicar here for over 40 years, so I'm quite familiar with the stories and secrets of our old families. Perhaps I could be of some assistance." The professor's impatience flickered behind polite words, as he replied that his true interest lay in documentary evidence. Diaries, letters, parish records, anything that could verify lineages and unearth forgotten truths. "I see," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Like the parish records Mr. Aldrich was consulting before his death. The marriage registers from the 1890s, if I'm not mistaken." This caught the professor's attention noticeably. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Do you know what specifically he was researching?" he asked, leaning in subtly. Miss Marple replied that she couldn't be certain, though she had heard from the vicar's wife that Aldrich had been particularly focused on marriages from 1895. A quick, almost imperceptible flicker of calculation passed through the professor's eyes before he masked it with a courteous smile. "Most interesting indeed," he murmured, before excusing himself and suggesting they might continue the conversation later, perhaps at tea time around 4 o'clock. After his departure, Flora's face was clouded with worry as she confided to Miss Marple that she felt overwhelmed by the sudden and almost desperate interest in Aldrich's journals, especially that singular volume from 1895, which Aldrich had guarded jealously. "He was always so protective," she whispered. Miss Marple advised her to trust her instincts and assured her that Aldrich clearly valued her discretion. Then, almost as an afterthought but with a sharp edge of curiosity, she asked if Aldrich had ever mentioned the stolen fruit tart recipe, the famous family recipe lost during the village festival. Flora shook her head but recounted how deeply upset Aldrich had been by its disappearance, calling it irreplaceable, not just a recipe but a treasured legacy. Then, hesitating as if revealing a secret, she recalled something odd Aldrich had said the day before his death. "The recipe isn't just about making tarts, Flora, it's about making things right." Those words lit a spark in Miss Marple's mind as she sat later in her dimly lit cottage, the fading twilight casting long shadows across her notes. The threads were beginning to weave together, a curious obsession with parish marriage records from 1895, the stolen recipe described as irreplaceable, Aldrich's sudden death coinciding mysteriously with Ed Witherspoon's unexpected return to the village after 15 years away, and the journals that contained not only recipes and business notes, but also careful observations about the village and its inhabitants, like the cryptic chronicles of a hidden historian. Miss Marple knew well that secrets, long buried in silence, could become deadly weapons when exposed to the harsh light of day. Some truths, like rare nocturnal plants, thrived only in darkness and withered under scrutiny. Yet as the last rays of the setting sun slipped behind her garden fence, she realized that no matter how deeply some sought to conceal the past, the truth had a relentless way of surfacing, and when it did, the consequences could unravel lives and reputations, threatening the delicate balance of the entire village, especially for those with the most to lose. Miss Marple arrived at the church early, as was her custom, dressed in sober black and carrying her ever-present knitting bag, selecting a pew near the back that offered a clear vantage point over the gathering crowd. The village had turned out in full force to pay their respects to Mr. Aldrich, whose bread and pastries had quietly sustained their community for over 30 years, weaving him into the very fabric of their lives. The soft click of Miss Marple's knitting needles was a gentle metronome amidst the murmurs and footsteps as mourners filed in, familiar faces from the high street, regular customers, and most intriguingly, Lady Penelope Withers, who had arrived not with her nephew Edward, but accompanied by Mr. Graves, her steely-faced solicitor. "Good morning, Miss Marple," whispered Mrs. Bantry as she slipped into the pew beside her, her voice low with curiosity. "Such a turnout. I can't recall ever seeing Lady Penelope at a village funeral before this." "No indeed," murmured Miss Marple without pausing her knitting, "and notice how tense she is, not merely sorrowful, but alert, almost wary, as if expecting something." Mrs. Bantry nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "And Mr. Graves looks positively grim, doesn't he? Oh, and there's Edward Witherspoon now," she added softly. "He's chosen to sit well apart from his aunt." Miss Marple's sharp gaze followed Edward, tall and imposing in his dark suit, deliberately settling in a pew opposite Lady Penelope's, their eyes briefly locking across the aisle in a silent exchange, a flicker of challenge, or perhaps a warning. The service began, the vicar's calm voice weaving familiar words of comfort and remembrance, the clicking needles of Miss Marple, a soft counterpoint to the hymns and prayers. During the eulogy, she noticed Mr. Graves lean over to whisper something to Lady Penelope. Her slight stiffening, clutching her prayer book more tightly, betrayed a sudden tension beneath her composed exterior. After the service, as the congregation moved to the church hall for refreshments, Miss Marple positioned herself near a corner table, ostensibly absorbed in her knitting but ever watchful. Flora Bennet circulated with quiet dignity, accepting condolences, while Professor Hargreaves engaged in what looked like a tense discussion with Edward Witherspoon near the punch bowl. Quite the gathering of interested parties, Miss Marple murmured to herself, eyes narrowing as Mr. Graves approached Flora with a look of urgent insistence, only to be met with her firm refusal, which darkened the solicitor's face momentarily before he masked it with practiced composure. Later that afternoon, under the guise of discussing arrangements for the upcoming harvest festival, Miss Marple visited the vicarage, where Reverend Clement welcomed her into his study, a cozy room lined with theological tomes and aged parish records. "Ah, Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," he said warmly. "Mrs. Clement mentioned you might be stopping by about the flower arrangements." "Yes indeed," she smiled, though her real purpose was more pressing. "I've heard Miss Aldridge was researching your parish records shortly before his death." The vicar nodded, polishing his spectacles thoughtfully. "Yes, he spent many afternoons here, most fascinated by the marriage registers from the 1890s. Miss Marple inquired if Aldridge had mentioned what specifically he sought, and Reverend Clement replied with a cautious tone, "Not explicitly, but I did notice he fixated on entries from 1895. He frowned, adding, I found something curious after his visits. One of the pages dating from June 1895 was torn out, not recently, but many years ago. When I brought this to Mr. Aldridge's attention, he was unsurprised, as if he had expected it." Miss Marple murmured, how very intriguing, her mind racing with possibilities. Such gaps in historical records can conceal far more than mere omissions. As she left the vicarage, the chill autumn air wrapping around her, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled with the implications: torn pages, secretive researches, divided families, and a community on the edge of long-buried truths threatening to surface once more. Taking a circuitous path home that wound quietly past the sprawling, meticulously kept grounds of Thornfield Estate, its famed gardens whispered about in county circles, yet rarely glimpsed by outsiders due to Lady Penelope Witherspoon's fierce insistence on privacy, Miss Marple paused beneath the muted afternoon light to admire the distant rose terrace, its blooms fading gently with the season, when her keen eyes caught sight of an elderly man bent over pruning near the ancient stone perimeter wall. "Good afternoon," she called out with a warm smile. "The dahlias seem especially fine this year, don't they?" The gardener straightened slowly, a weary smile tugging at his weathered face, one hand pressed against the small of his back as if warding off an old ache. "They're putting on a good show, Miss Marple, though the frost's coming soon," he replied in a voice roughened by years spent toiling outdoors. She studied his gnarled hands, so shaped by decades of coaxing life from the earth, and remarked casually, "You must have been here at Thornfield for many years." "Man and boy, miss," he nodded solemnly. 62 years come Michaelmas, starting back under the old Lord Witherspoon, before the current lady took over. Miss Marple marveled at such steadfast service, noting quietly how some things changed with time while others stubbornly endured. "Gardens grow, fade and bloom anew," he said thoughtfully. "And families, well, they have their own seasons, ups and downs, just like nature. Both follow patterns, don't they?" "Indeed they do," agreed Miss Marple, her eyes narrowing with a sudden spark of curiosity. "I suppose you must have known Lady Penelope since she was quite young then." The old man's gaze flickered, something like caution, or perhaps an old memory stirring beneath the surface. "I knew them all," he said slowly. "The old lord, Lady Penelope, and her sister, a sister who died young. Sad business that was." Miss Marple's interest sharpened immediately. "A sister?" she asked softly. "I don't believe I've ever heard mention of a sister." The gardener's posture stiffened, and his voice dropped to a wary whisper. "It was long ago, before the scandal with the kitchen girl even. Not something talked about much at Thornfield." "The kitchen girl," Miss Marple prompted gently, sensing the weight behind the words. The old man seemed to realize he had revealed more than intended. "Never mind an old man's ramblings," he said brusquely, turning back to his pruning with a measured, deliberate motion. "It's all water under the bridge now, 60 years or more." Miss Marple noted the time frame carefully, around 1895 perhaps. The silence that fell over his shears as they paused mid-prune spoke volumes. Walking on, her mind raced with this new thread. A long-buried scandal involving a kitchen girl at Thornfield Estate. Around the same year a page vanished from the parish marriage register, torn clean from June 1895. Mr. Aldridge's intense focus on that precise period suddenly took on new significance, as did the gathering of seemingly disparate figures. Lady Penelope, Edward Witherspoon, the grim Mr. Graves, and the enigmatic Professor Hargreaves, all entwined now in a web of secrets linked to the baker's journals and a missing recipe, cryptically described by Flora as not merely a formula for tarts but a way to set things right. As Miss Marple neared her cottage, the lengthening evening shadows stretched over her garden path, and she felt the familiar stirring of a puzzle beginning to take shape, not yet whole but with edges coming sharply into focus, framing the mystery's heart. Torn pages, silent histories, secret journals, and a baker who died clutching an empty bottle of almond extract, all signs that someone was desperate to keep the past buried. Yet, as Miss Marple well knew from decades immersed in village life, such secrets were like stones turned by frost in a plowed field. Inevitably they rose, rough and persistent, until the truth was unearthed. Later, as the morning sun streamed gently through her window and the quiet rhythm of knitting filled the room, the sudden unmistakable roar of Inspector Slack's motor car pulling up outside shattered the calm. Setting aside her work, she rose to answer the door just as the inspector lifted his hand to knock. "Good morning, Inspector," she greeted with mild surprise. Inspector Slack, who found little pleasure in summoning village elders for consultations yet recognized Miss Marple's shrewd insight, nodded curtly. "May I come in, Miss Marple? There have been developments in the Aldridge case." "Developments," she echoed, motioning him inside, her mind already alert to the fresh twists that might soon unravel the quiet surface of Thornfield and the village beyond. Inspector Slack's sudden arrival at Miss Marple's quaint cottage that quiet morning shattered the peaceful rhythm of her day, his face etched with tension as he delivered a revelation that transformed the entire case. The bottle of almond extract found clutched in Mr. Aldridge's hand was no harmless kitchen staple but concealed a deadly dose of cyanide, conclusively proving that his death was murder, not accident. Miss Marple listened intently, her calm exterior belying the sharp surge of intrigue sparked by this dark twist. Slack, fully aware of her intimate knowledge of the village and its residents, sought her insights into any recent disputes or strange behavior involving Aldridge, but the motive remained elusive. The stolen recipe, initially dismissed as trivial, now seemed a possible key to the mystery. Miss Marple mused that it must contain far more than mere baking instructions, perhaps hidden knowledge or a secret powerful enough to provoke lethal desperation. She revealed Aldridge's recent deep dive into the parish marriage records from 1895, coupled with his careful journals documenting village affairs for over 30 years, which had already attracted interest from an unsettling circle. Lady Penelope's determined solicitor, Edward Witherspoon, the inscrutable Mr. Graves, and a mysterious Professor Hargreaves from London, each circling warily like vultures hungry for the truth concealed in Aldridge's meticulous writings. After Slack's departure, Miss Marple invited her trusted friend Dolly Bantry for tea, and over the steaming cups, she unfolded the grim details. The cyanide poisoning, the missing recipe's possible coded message, and the whispers of a long-buried scandal, involving a kitchen girl at Thornfield Estate from decades ago. Bantry, shocked by the murder in their usually quiet village, was drawn deeper into Marple's reflections on a similarly tangled case from 30 years earlier, involving Mrs. Ellington, whose blackberry cordial recipe hid a deadly secret and concealed her true will, illustrating how seemingly innocent recipes could mask deadly truths and sinister motives. The suggestion that Aldridge's recipe might encode evidence of an irregular, possibly illicit union between a Witherspoon and a servant sent a chill through their conversation, explaining Edward Witherspoon's sudden reappearance after 15 years, Lady Penelope's uncharacteristic preoccupation with Aldridge's funeral, and the increasing desperation surrounding the stolen recipe. With Bantry's departure, Miss Marple's mind raced with new possibilities, and compelled by the pressing urgency of unraveling these, she decided to visit the bakery one last time that fading afternoon. The quiet hum of the high street was punctuated by the soft jingle of the shop bell as she entered, the promise of Flora Bennet's presence hinting at fresh revelations and deeper secrets yet to come, all entwined in the shadowed past of Thornfield Estate and the deadly recipe that had sparked a murderous pursuit of truth. As Miss Marple stepped quietly into the warm, fragrant back room of the bakery, the comforting scent of freshly baked lemon buns still lingered in the air, and Flora, the young woman tidying up with a gentle, practiced motion, greeted her with a soft smile, and an offer of one of the still warm buns. "Would you care for one?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of kindness that momentarily eased the tension in the room. But Miss Marple, her mind already racing with the weight of new developments, declined graciously, her eyes fixed on the imposing wooden cabinet that dominated the far wall. She explained delicately that Inspector Slack was soon to examine Mr. Aldridge's recipe books, and she hoped to assist by identifying anything that might be of significance to the ongoing investigation into the baker's suspicious death. Flora's hesitation was brief but telling, her gaze flickering with an unspoken concern before she finally nodded and led Miss Marple to the cabinet. "Mr. Aldridge always spoke very highly of you," she said quietly, almost reverently, as she pushed open the cabinet doors to reveal rows upon rows of meticulously kept leather-bound journals and notebooks, all carefully dated and arranged with near obsessive precision, each one a testament to Aldridge's methodical nature, and his refusal to entrust his records to anything but his own steady hand. As Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the orderly volumes, something immediately struck her as odd. While the majority were neatly filed by year, a select few had been deliberately displaced, their chronological order disrupted as they sat jarringly out of sequence, shelved among volumes from vastly different decades. This struck Miss Marple as more than mere oversight. It hinted at a secret code or hidden message, a silent cry for discovery amid the dust of forgotten pages. Gently removing one of these misplaced volumes, dated 1909 but nestled inexplicably between books from the mid-1920s, Miss Marple carefully leafed through its fragile pages, causing a faded photograph to slip quietly to the floor. The image depicted a young woman dressed plainly in a maid's uniform, her expression serious yet bright with the sharp intelligence of youth, an enigma frozen in time. Curious, Miss Marple held up the photograph for Flora, who admitted she had never seen the woman before, but then noticed a faint inscription on the back, written in delicate fading ink. "Mary Briggs, kitchen maid, Thornfield Estate, 1894. As Flora returned to the front shop to serve a late customer, Miss Marple's fingers traced the worn edges of the journals, piecing together a puzzle that now seemed more intricate and perilous than ever. The pattern of misplaced volumes, far from accidental, felt like a deliberate breadcrumb trail, leading toward a long-buried secret. One by one she gathered these out-of-place journals, leafing through their yellowed pages until, tucked carefully inside the last volume, she uncovered a folded, brittle document. A fragment of a birth certificate, its paper stained by age but still legible, bearing the name Catherine Mary, born June 14, 1895. The father's name was partially torn away, yet the unmistakable initial W remained, a ghostly clue hinting at a concealed lineage. Miss Marple's mind raced as the pieces clicked into place. June 1895, the same month a parish marriage register bore a torn entry, "Mary Briggs, the Thornfield kitchen maid," and a mysterious purra, perhaps the first letter of a name once whispered behind closed doors and swiftly silenced. Later that evening, returning from a discreet visit to the vicarage to cross-reference these discoveries, Miss Marple was unsettled to find her modest cottage in disarray, papers scattered and cushions upturned, though nothing appeared stolen. Whoever had rifled through her belongings was searching desperately for something, likely the very clues she had uncovered that day in Aldridge's journals. Standing amidst the quiet chaos, a chill crept over her, the invisible threads of this dark, tangled mystery tightening ominously around her. Resolute, she decided she must act quickly and with cunning. She planned to enlist the ever-resourceful Dolly Bantry's help in orchestrating a delicate gathering, a tea party at Gossington Hall, where all the key figures tangled in this shadowed web could be brought together under the guise of civility and shared hospitality, over carefully prepared refreshments, and perhaps a recreation of Mr. Aldridge's celebrated fruit tart, whose recipe might itself be a cipher of secrets. The truth, Miss Marple hoped, would finally emerge from the shadows, revealing the hidden motives and deadly betrayals behind the seemingly quiet village's most chilling crime. The drawing room at Gossington Hall was meticulously arranged with Mrs. Bantry's characteristic eye for detail, every piece of furniture and decoration seemingly placed to perfection, while the soft afternoon sunlight streamed gently through the towering windows, casting a warm golden glow that danced across the gathered company, wrapping them in an almost surreal calm that belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. Miss Marple sat comfortably in a well-worn armchair near the fireplace, her knitting resting forgotten in her lap, as her sharp, pale blue eyes scanned the room with a quiet intensity, noting every subtle gesture and fleeting expression. Lady Penelope Witherspoon had arrived precisely on time, her aristocratic demeanor unshaken, though the rigid set of her shoulders betrayed the weight of a storm she kept carefully concealed, sitting apart from the others like a displaced queen forced into exile, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Bantry, with an icy politeness that barely concealed the steely resolve within her. Hovering nearby was Mr. Graves, whose anxious presence clung to her like a shadow, while Edward Witherspoon stood by the window, stealing occasional glances at his aunt with a complex mix of resentment and weary frustration etched deeply across his face. Close by, Professor Hargreaves maintained a scholarly detachment, though his frequent, almost compulsive adjustment of his spectacles betrayed a nervousness that Miss Marple observed with subtle amusement. Flora Bennet had come directly from the bakery, bearing at Miss Marple's specific request a painstaking recreation of Mr. Aldridge's famed fruit tart, now displayed on the sideboard like a silent exhibit of evidence, tempting and mysterious. Near the door, Inspector Slack lingered reluctantly, his posture tense and alert, as if bracing for the inevitable trouble the evening promised to bring. "How kind of you all to come," Mrs. Bantry began brightly, though her voice trembled slightly with suppressed emotion. "I thought it fitting to gather here in memory of poor Mr. Aldridge. Miss Marple has been helping me unravel the strange circumstances surrounding his passing, and she has some thoughts to share." All eyes turned to Miss Marple, who smiled gently, her voice soft yet carrying clearly through the suddenly hushed room. "I have been reflecting on the events of the past few weeks," she said, "the disappearance of Mr. Aldridge's recipe at the festival, his untimely death, and the curious fascination so many have shown with his private papers. It all reminded me of a case from the village many years ago, one of hidden identities and a nearly forgotten inheritance." Lady Penelope shifted uneasily in her seat, her tone cold as she interrupted. "I fail to see how any of this concerns us." "It concerns Thornfield Estate," Miss Marple replied calmly, "and a kitchen maid named Mary Briggs who worked there in 1894. A subtle flinch from Lady Penelope confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Mary Briggs, as I discovered, was secretly married in the spring of 1895, as recorded in the parish register, on a page that was later torn out. She gave birth to a daughter, Catherine Mary, on June 14 of that same year." Professor Hargreaves leaned forward, intrigued. "You claim to have proof of this marriage, yet the register pages are missing." "The proof," said Miss Marple, "was hidden in Mr. Aldridge's fruit tart recipe, not in the ingredients, but in the precise measurements and method of preparation. When decoded properly, they reveal dates, initials and a location. The recipe was never merely a family heirloom. It was a cipher, a secret way to preserve the truth after all other records had been destroyed." "This is preposterous," Lady Penelope declared, though her voice wavered, betraying doubt. "Is it?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Perhaps you can explain why your solicitor, Mr. Graves, took such an intense interest in Mr. Aldridge's 1895 journal, or why you attended the funeral of a humble village baker, a man you would ordinarily dismiss as beneath your notice. Edward Witherspoon's expression shifted from weary to intensely focused. Who was the father? He asked softly. The father of Catherine Mary. Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. William Witherspoon, your grandfather and Lady Penelope's father. He married Mary Briggs in secret, knowing his family would never accept a servant as his wife. The marriage was legal and binding, but after Mary died in childbirth, the child was entrusted to Mary's cousin, a baker named Aldridge. A collective gasp filled the room as Flora Bennet clasped her hand over her mouth in shock. Mr. Aldridge had been raised by his mother's cousin, unaware of his true parentage. The weight of this long-buried secret now hung heavily over the room, binding the assembled guests in a tense web of suspicion and hidden truths, each of them unwitting players in a dangerous game whose outcome was as uncertain as the flickering shadows cast by the dying afternoon light. As thunder cracked like a verdict from the heavens and wind clawed at the ancient stained-glass windows of Wrenmore Manor, Miss Eliza Blackthorne stood poised, an almost spectral figure in the flickering firelight, holding the old, time-worn leather journal with the kind of reverence reserved for holy texts and buried truths. Her voice, low and deliberate, cut through the silence like a blade. It was never the property, nor the wealth, it was always the secret hidden in guilt, guarded in fear. She turned, her gaze resting on Thomas Avery, who stood trembling, unsure whether the storm within him was louder than the one outside. Around them, the air grew heavier. Lady Camilla shrank into her chair, her face ashen, hands clutched around a locket she once believed held the last piece of her family's legacy. Colonel Redgrave stood rigid, every line on his face suddenly like cracks in a facade too long maintained. This journal, continued Eliza, lifting it slightly, belongs to your mother, Thomas. Margaret Elmsley. And these pages hold the truth about your birth, and the shame the Raven Shades tried to bury for over 2 decades. A choking sound escaped Lady Camilla. Margaret was never just a maid, Eliza said firmly. She was Edmund Ravenshade's wife, they were married in secret, and you, Thomas, are their son. The rightful heir of this estate. A stunned silence blanketed the room like snowfall, all color drained from Redgrave's face. Clara, usually quiet and composed, stepped forward with trembling conviction. We cross-referenced the journal entries with parish registries. The wedding certificate was hidden, but we found the duplicate in the vicar's archives. Thomas's knees buckled, but he caught the edge of a chair. Memories, blurry, fragmented, now clicked into place. The whispers, the strange dreams, the inexplicable longing he felt when walking through the manor's orchard. You tried to erase him, Eliza turned to Redgrave, her voice steel. You paid off the midwife, bribed the vicar, you burned documents, poisoned the old caretaker when he remembered too much. And when Thomas returned, unknowingly chasing his own bloodline, you tried again. Clara opened a small pouch and pulled out the final piece, a tiny vial, still carrying the faint scent of belladonna. This was found in your study. The same substance that killed Edgar, and nearly killed Thomas. Redgrave tried to speak, but words choked in his throat. Constable Hale, silent until now, emerged from the shadows and took him by the arm. You're finished, he said, his voice calm, final. As Redgrave was led away, the storm outside began to subside, as if justice had calmed the very skies. Miss Blackthorne turned to Thomas, who was now sitting, eyes wide with shock and tears threatening to fall. She walked over slowly, placing the journal into his hands. You were never a servant, she said softly. You were always meant to return home. He looked down at the fragile pages, running his fingers across the ink written by a mother he never knew, a name reclaimed, a legacy restored. It wasn't riches he inherited, nor title, it was truth. And that truth was more powerful than any estate. Clara placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. What will you do now? She asked. Thomas looked around the manor, no longer a stranger's house but his home. I think, he said quietly, I'll start by unlocking every door they once sealed. And as dawn began to edge over the moor, casting golden light on the rain-slicked windows, peace, long denied, settled over Wrenmore at last. Not the quiet of secrecy, but the silence that follows after truth is finally spoken.